But UCLA is really where I got so much of my professional career started. I started off as a peer mentor at the UCLA Career Center, and that was what really gave me direction to be able to navigate my career path of going into counseling. I pursued a master's in counseling, specializing in college counseling and student services. And I've now been working in the counseling and higher ed sector for over a decade. I've had the opportunity to help students get into college. I've had this opportunity to serve as the director for an admissions services program as part of an MCAT company. And I am now the founder and lead counselor of Next Step Admissions. With this, I've had the opportunity to support over 500 students through the medical school application process who have successfully matriculated to schools all around the country and all around the world, including schools like Harvard Med, UCLA, Stanford, Yale. And now I am here to help all of you. So, as you know, the medical school application timeline is a lengthy one. It starts very early and runs for several months. And a huge part of the application process is getting on top of the timeline, starting early and prioritizing every single written component of the application, every part of the application that requires strategizing to ensure that you have the best chance of earning an acceptance. Part of the application cycle is the content you're submitting. Part of it will go into your stats, part of it, the essays, and another part will be the timeline and how you strategically navigate it, because that can be a huge factor in supporting or creating challenges in your application process. So we're going to dive into multiple parts of the application timeline today. We're going to address really everything from pre-med courses to your GPA and MCAT, just because understanding your stats is a little bit of a factor that plays into that timeline and the school selection process that'll come a little bit later. We're going to discuss the personal statement timeline and what it entails, experiences, letters of recommendation, school selection, the primary application submission, Casper and preview, secondaries, interviews, letters of interest or update letters, letters of intent, and of course, the glorious acceptance. So hopefully throughout the course of this session, we'll be able to explore strategies and timelines to help you master your medical school application and go into the process with complete confidence. However, before we dive in, I want to take a moment to understand where you all stand in the process. So if you don't mind, if you can put in the chat if you are applying this year, if you're applying next year, if you've started the app, just so I can kind of use that to tailor the content that we'll be reviewing today. This cycle, next year, this year, this year, this year, next year. Love that you're all contributing in the chat. It absolutely supports your process too, because the more you're willing to give, the more we're going to be able to tailor this session to ensure that you're getting all your needs met as well. So we have a lot of students applying this year, some applying next year, some applying in 2 years. So good on all of you. Those that are applying this year, this is a really pivotal time in the cycle, and you're really going to want to get ahead of every moment these next couple months. And those of you that are here right now preparing for the next couple years, it's great that you're getting an early start and understanding what that application process is going to entail as you progress in your academic career. And just take notes today and be sure that you are ready to apply it when it's your turn. And again, I am here to answer any questions you have throughout the course of the session. And we will now kind of dive in and let's see what comes up. Okay. So starting off with the application timeline, we'll be addressing your pre-medical coursework. So this is something that you should be working on throughout your entire undergraduate career that should lead you to have the majority of your prereqs done by the time you're submitting your application. The goal is to have them all done by the time you submit your app, but if you have one or two remaining, that's completely okay. It just helps to have them all down because then you're able to show medical schools your understanding of the core content for many of the required prereqs, along with utilizing these classes to support you with the MCAT. However, if you have enough science courses completed before the application submission and you just have a couple that you have to submit later on, that's okay. Just ensure that you input those on your application so that medical schools are aware that they will be coming. In terms of the common prerequisites, those typically include Gen Chem, OChem, Bio, Physics, and English. Now, there are some recommended classes like statistics, calculus, psychology, sociology, anatomy, biochem, physiology. These depend on each school that you apply to. So that's where you want to make sure that as you're kind of creating a school list, you're also checking in on the desired courses for each one of those schools, because that may also lead you to adding a few classes in that upcoming year. Many students will move forward with the essential prereqs of the Gen Chem, OChem, Bio, Orgo, Physics, and English, but then some of those supplemental classes kind of fall through the cracks. So that's where, again, school selection is going to be a big part of understanding any remaining prereqs you have and any gaps that you'll need to fill and courses that you'll want to add to that timeline in the coming months. Also, keep in mind that if any of you are taking a few gap years off, since you're all still in undergrad, this isn't a big thing. But if any of you plan to take a few gap years off, make sure that all of your courses fall within 7 years for prerequisites. If you do take more time off than that, then make sure you're either retaking those prereqs or taking additional sciences, whether you've done another master's program or have been following other coursework, to just be able to show that continuous scientific inquiry to schools. Also, please note that nowadays a lot of schools have recommendations over requirements, so that will give you a little bit more flexibility as well in terms of the classes that you need to take. But always make sure that you are following along and ensure that if you do need to add courses, again, that you are incorporating that into your timeline from now. If you're looking at applying this year and you're looking at this list and notice one or two classes may be missing, keep that in mind as you start strategizing for how you're going to navigate the upcoming months to ensure that those are on your application. Next, we have the GPA. So right about now, you should all have a relatively good idea of where your grade point average stands in terms of your application process. Because we've already made it through the fall quarter and you're going to kind of come up on the end of the winter quarter soon, you should have a very strong gauge of what you're going to be applying with. If you do see that your grades for what you're expecting to take and receive in the spring quarter will make a big difference in your GPA, that's where you may want to consider waiting if it's going to be a huge jump to submit your application. But based on when UCLA's quarter ends, it could end up delaying your cycle. So I would say all of you by the end of this month should know exactly where your GPA stands for this application cycle. That's going to be huge in helping you determine what schools you apply to, because on one of the statistical components that plays out in your medical school application is going to be the grade point average. Usually, to have a strong chance for MD schools, you want to be around a 3.6. And then for DO schools, you want to be around a 3.3. For those 3.6 and 3.3 GPAs, usually you want that to be your science GPA, and ideally your cumulative, but the science is the one that most schools know kind of sometimes drops a little bit. So in many cases, that's the one that they're using as the threshold toward these averages. But you will have a cumulative GPA along with a science GPA. And with that science GPA, you want to make sure that you're aiming to see primarily B's and A's on your application. If you're looking and seeing that you have a large amount B minuses or C's on your transcript, which are technically passing, but could make it difficult for you to get into medical school, you may want to consider at that point looking into a post-bac or even a master's program in a gap year to be able to get that GPA up and show your understanding of scientific inquiry, and also be able to use that time to potentially incorporate another MCAT attempt if you think, again, the sciences are an area that you need to improve. However, this is where a GPA trend can also come in significantly, because sometimes students come to college and a school like UCLA, it's quarter system, it can be a huge shift from high school. And all of a sudden, you're taking all these fast-paced classes in a whole new environment, and those freshman year grades can slip a little bit. So if they are willing, or if they are able to see that you've had a consistent GPA trend that's been upward and you've shown dedication to your courses, consistent improvement, doing well in all your science prereqs, maybe after that first or second semester, that's going to be able to show a trend that can overcome a slight dip in the GPA if you have had such a challenge incorporated. This is where if you do have any questions about any specific grades or your thresholds, you can always ask at the end, more specifically related to your application, or you can email me about it so that we can determine if there's anything that can be done to improve this. But in terms of your timeline, your GPA should be pretty set at this point. You should have a good idea of where that stands. And we're going to discuss school selection in a moment. So you're kind of going to see the big picture of how this is going to come in life and have an effect. Then the other stat that's going to play a part in your application process is going to be the MCAT. With the MCAT, just so I understand here where you all stand, how many of you have taken the MCAT that are applying this year? My ideal timeline is to take it by March or April, but as I'll share with you now, I always suggest taking it when you think you will be able to do the best, because you don't want to rush into it by a few weeks or a month to have just for the sake of having a score. But it looks like most of you have taken it, which is great. Those of you that already took it, hope it went well. Hope you had a successful MCAT attempt. Keep in mind that since you're already on top of it and took that first attempt, that also gives you time, if you need to take it again, to be able to do that in April if you've already signed up for that attempt. And that would not negatively impact your application timeline in any way, because you would still have your MCAT score by May when you would be submitting. So those are just the little nuances that you want to consider in terms of the MCAT timeline. Obviously, you're all familiar, or should be familiar if you've already taken it. If not, and you're applying in a couple years, note that the MCAT has 4 sections: the chem physics, the biochem, the CARS, which is the critical analysis and reasoning skills, and the psych soc. Your goal to have a strong cycle, or really have the MCAT work best for you, is to have a minimum of 125 in each section. The national average for the MCAT for MD schools is a 512. So that's the point that's going to put you at the best position to be able to open the door for a wide range of MD schools. However, for DO schools, that's going to be closer to the 504, 505 range. And then if you are looking at top 20s, you want to be closer to the 516 range. So these are also things to keep in mind if you are looking to be able to kind of achieve a certain score in the coming months. If you're already there, fantastic. If you know that maybe a reattempt is needed, note that you can easily take the MCAT again in April with no challenges to your timeline. And if you're looking for a little bit of a bump, you can also take it again in May, though be aware of May, because the challenge with that is that you won't know your score. So if there's a dip or it doesn't really align with the rest of your application, it wouldn't really benefit you. But since you already have an attempt, it's not something that would be fully detrimental. For those of you that have not applied yet or will be applying in the future, there is something to keep in mind regarding applying without your scores. That is something that is an option. Don't think that's very common for UCLA students, but you never know what happens. Sometimes life gets in the way at the last minute right before you take the MCAT. But if you apply without your MCAT score, so you submit in May and you also take the MCAT in May, let's say, you can apply to one school. I usually suggest like a throwaway school that you're not really interested in going to so that it wouldn't impact your application either way. And just submit that so you can start getting your application verified. And then we'll discuss the application verification as we go. But you can get your application verified so it doesn't delay your primary application submission at all or your application timeline. And then once you get your MCAT score, we'll be able to use that to then diversify a school list that aligns with your GPA, MCAT score, and the rest of your application. All right, now comes the personal statement. So this is an essay that seems really straightforward, and so many of you probably write essays in really short spans of time in general, and you're great at cranking things out really quickly. With your medical school personal statement, I suggest diving into this as soon as possible, ideally in the winter, so this is the time. March is kind of like that cutoff that I suggest to get started with the MCAT, or sorry, the personal statement. Of course, I've helped students that have also started the personal statement as late as May, and we're still able to craft a great statement that got them in. But this is just to have the ideal timeline and the least amount of stress for you. If you start now in March, you're going to be able to create a personal statement that's going to be able to run through multiple rounds of edits, multiple feedback rounds through different individuals that you'll have reviewing your essays. You'll be able to implement different concepts or different anecdotes and play with them to see what you like or don't like, or what best aligns with your story. And if this occurs closer to the application deadline, it's going to be much harder to be able to do that. But if you tackle that now, you're going to have time to be able to, again, run through those multiple versions to get to that perfected draft. Usually, most students I see run through like 6 to 10 different drafts or iterations of their statement. So the sooner you dive in, the better. And then many of you are probably finishing out courses right now while you're also starting with experiences and requesting letters. So the sooner you have a draft for this, the sooner you're going to be able to have that peace of mind with the personal statement. With this statement, remember that a big purpose of this is understanding your why. Medical schools want to see why you are pursuing a career in medicine, what the motivation was, what initiatives you've taken since exploring this pathway, and what experiences align with this route. Usually I tell students to incorporate around 4 to 6 anecdotes in the personal statement that allow us to showcase that full story of really starting off with the initial experience that opened the door to medicine, and then the experiences that allow us to showcase that passion throughout the years. With your personal statement, make sure you show instead of telling. With this, showing is going to allow you to illustrate experiences as opposed to just telling them. It's really easy to say that you've worked as a medical assistant for multiple years and seen many patients that struggled, and as a result, now want to be a physician. What sets you apart is drawing them through a specific patient example, the challenges they faced with an insurance company or a healthcare challenge and their family members there, and really seeing the physician advocate for them or even take the time to explain something about their treatment measures that nobody had told them before. All these extended examples, all these imagery perceptions that you'll be able to provide with your personal statement will be what make the difference in showing the committee why you stand out and where your passion comes to life. Every year, around 60% of students that apply to medical school unfortunately do not get in. And a big part of that is the personal statement and how students convey themselves. If you're looking at two students with very similar statistics, very similar MCAT and GPA, the part that's going to set them apart is going to be that personal statement. So take advantage of the timeline, jump into this now so that you can differentiate yourself and include qualities that set you apart from other applicants. Experiences. So this is the other component that involves quite a bit of writing in the application process. With experiences, please make sure that you are writing in complete sentences and giving clear depictions of your experiences that have led you to this path to medicine and other experiences that you've just had over the years that really allow medical schools to see who you are, where you spend your time, skills that you've built, and the kind of holistic applicant you will be to strengthen your chances of becoming a physician. You want to show medical schools that you are a well-rounded applicant. So including experiences in multiple different areas will be the way to do that. Starting with clinical experiences and patient-facing interactions, research opportunities to show that scientific inquiry and the desire to advance medicine, community involvement and your desire to support underserved populations, whether it's in a clinical or non-clinical setting, leadership opportunities or initiatives that you've taken in different experiences to be able to show your ability to lead others, to create impact, quality experiences with significant hours in them, as opposed to just obtaining multiple experiences for the sake of hitting as many experience boxes as possible, and always looking to integrate core competencies into strengthening your application so that medical schools can see how you're able to align with what they are looking for in a candidate. With the MCAS application, you're able to include 15 different experiences, and AMCAS is going to be the MD application system. Within these 15 experiences, they're going to fall in multiple different experience types. You want to fulfill as many as possible, but again, quality over quantity. You don't want to just try to hit 15 for the sake of hitting 15. Make sure that you have substantive experiences that really showcase your involvement in these opportunities. The goal that I always suggest is aiming for around 500 hours of clinical experience, 500 hours of research, and around 250, whether it's in community involvement or leadership or a little bit of shadowing in there as well, since shadowing is separate from clinical, since it's a more passive opportunity. But that's kind of like where you want to think about those hours. So if you're assessing right now and thinking, wait a second, I'm applying, but I haven't done any research, or my clinical hours are like at 200 hours or something like that, this is the time to really get started with the process and look into these upcoming weeks and months to incorporate an additional experience that you can also put on your application. Of course, you don't want all those hours to be coming in the coming year, but for the MD application, you are able to incorporate upcoming experiences and those upcoming hours. So if you're short by a little bit, that can come in there. Also note that with the experiences, as much as we're talking about quality over quantity, I do suggest incorporating around 10 experiences at the minimum, just because you've been in college for 4 years. That shows a good amount of time you've been here. Honors and awards can also count as experiences along with publications. So we want to be cautious about noting just 1 or 2 experiences. The exception to this, we've seen a few students apply with like less than 6 or 7 experiences. And the exception is many of them had been like career changers and had participated in occupations for 5-10 years, or had to hold caretaker responsibilities within the family, which all impacted their ability to be able to expand out into more significant or more diversified experiences, and led them to kind of hold a few roles for multiple years. So that would kind of be the exception if that applies to you in any way. And again, happy to talk about those exceptions in any way for you too. Keep in mind, for experiences, you want to focus on college and beyond when inputting these. The only time that you would incorporate high school is, let's say you were like doing a hobby in high school or something, and those hours then continued into college, that's where that would come in. Otherwise, try to keep the experiences to college only. If you did have any experiences that really impacted your medical school application trajectory, you can include those in your personal statement, as those experiences can be a part of your story as to why you're pursuing a career in medicine. Again, this is a great time to get started with the experiences as well. I usually suggest having a basis for your personal statement before you dive into your experience descriptions, just so that you have a little bit of a different perspective, because we don't want to be using the same stories in every space of the application. So if you already know what you're going to include in your personal statement about, let's say, your medical assistant position or your research at the neurology lab, or your community-based opportunity at an after-school program. If you already know what you're writing about for those in your personal statement, then you'll know the lens you want to take for your experience descriptions as well, to allow schools to see a different side of you. But again, 700 characters is a lot, and you're kind of writing like a mini story, a kind of like one paragraph description, again, identifying anywhere that you can show what you've done. So avoid making that one a resume. I've seen a lot of students just kind of take their resume bullets and copy it into that experience description. That's not what they're looking for. They want to see how you stand out. They want to see what you have done in that role that's different from the other medical assistants, the other supplemental instructors, the other club presidents. Do we have any questions at this time? Yes, it is 700 characters per activity. And then your three most meaningful activities for the MCAS application will get an extra 1,325 characters. That's going to be on top of the 700. And it's going to be a separate entry for your most meaningful experience, where you're going to be able to identify the impact that the experience had on you and the impact you had on the experience and why it was one of your most meaningful. Yes, you should use anecdotes and stories. Always avoid writing out the experiences like a resume. That's going to make it really challenging for your experience description to stand out. But if you're putting yourself in that clinical setting, in that classroom setting, you're able to then walk them through why the experience was unique to you. GPA and MCAT both weigh in pretty significantly, but I would say historically the MCAT is what is easier to offset a GPA that may not be as aligned. On the flip side, if a student has like a 4.0 and then their MCAT score is like a 5.05, that's going to be really difficult to compensate for. But again, if you have like a 3.5 GPA and then like a 5.15 MCAT, that can kind of do the work in making up for it. So overall, both hold weight preliminarily, but the MCAT can oftentimes do a bigger or better job of compensating for a more challenged GPA. GPA from UCLA isn't really seen differently from other schools. It does show that you can absolutely handle a challenging curriculum, but a lot of times the other way that other schools can compensate for it is with their MCAT score. So if a student has, again, like a 4.0 from 4.0 GPA from UCLA, but then like a 5.05 MCAT score versus another student that, let's say, went to like one of the Cal States and has a 4.0, but on the other end managed to get a 514 on the MCAT. They understand the rigor of UCLA, but then that 514 from the other student shows that their competency of their coursework kind of made up for any level of rigor that may have varied. So they've still been able to stand out. If you are a student that's like a 4.0 student and getting a really high MCAT score from UCLA as well, then that's where it will be seen a little bit differently and give you a little bit more leverage. Should you put in Latin honors in this, or is this or is it implied based on your GPA? So it's all going to be based on your GPA at UCLA following a 4.0 grade scale. So if the Latin Honors was a course that was taken at UCLA, you will put it on there, but it's not going to give you any benefit in terms of like a higher GPA scale. It's still going to go off of 4.0. MCAT can offset a lower amount of extracurricular. I'd say by like a couple hundred hours potentially. Keep in mind, sometimes when you are applying to some schools that maybe have that higher MCAT score, those schools are also going to have other candidates that also have higher experience hours or even more impactful experiences. But on the other end, if you have that higher MCAT score and you're applying to a school that may be a little bit less competitive and you don't have as many extracurricular hours, but your MCAT score is above their average by a few points, that's where it can offset. GPA from community colleges is not a disadvantage as long as, again, you're still able to showcase that you were able to maintain your GPA at the university and that you were able to obtain a high MCAT score. So the only time the community college classes can pose a disadvantage is, let's say you have a 4.0 at Santa Monica College, and then you go to UCLA and your GPA drops to a 3.2. That's the only time where they may see a little bit of a discrepancy. But if you went to UCLA, got a 4.0 or 3.8, you were at SMC, had a 4.0, and those GPAs are very similar, and you're getting an MCAT score above the national average, then that community college coursework won't pose any challenge there. One thing I would suggest here is if you are looking into like a post-bac or MCAT or things like that, one aspect of the community college that can pose a little bit of a challenge is if after you graduate from UCLA, you look into the community college for a post-bac. The only time that that kind of becomes justifiable is if you are showcasing, like if there's a financial hardship or familial disadvantage that requires you to be close to home, things like that. Outside of that, sometimes it could be perceived as looking for a route that's going to give you a little bit of a higher GPA than if you were to do the post-bac or masters. But again, schools do understand that the post-bac and masters are very costly. So if you do go like the do-it-yourself route of completing like other sciences at a community college or something, just make sure it's justifiable as to why. The only other time that the community college classes can pose a direct challenge is if while you're at UCLA, you are consistently going to a community college to do the sciences as opposed to attempting any of them at the university, as that could make it perceived that you are kind of trying to avoid the more challenging sciences at the more challenging institution to keep that GPA. But then again, a lot of times that gets unveiled with the MCAT. You can include one entry for honors like summa cum laude, magna cum laude, things like that. I usually try not to utilize more than one experience toward that, just because, again, those are experiences that, like, if you're summa cum laude, fantastic, but they will also be able to put that together through the rest of your application. But if you have space for it, I would put that in there. A lot of times for those honors, I suggest like one activity entry for it, and then you can put up to 4 experiences in that one activity entry. Whoopsies, accidentally paused sharing my screen because I accidentally opened the link Christina put in the chat.
We
Give me
can
one
still
second.
see your screen.
Oh,
At
you
least
still see
I
it? Okay,
can.
great. It said it paused it. Okay. Going back into it, and let me just check the chat real quick to see if there's anything else. If we take a gap year or two to get more clinical experiences, do we also need to continue to get hours for research and other experiences? Not necessarily, as long as you have experience hours in those other areas to be able to show on your application. If you're doing just clinical and you haven't previously done the other areas, then I would suggest maybe looking into filling the other gaps as well. But if you already have like good leadership experiences, community involvement, research, you've shadowed physicians and you're just focused on clinical now, then that's totally understandable. They also know that in many cases, if students have graduated, they may need a little bit of a career pathway or being able to bring a little income in. So that's where the continuous clinical opportunities can make sense in that way too. If I'm a psych major and still need to take prereqs after graduating, where would you recommend? This is where it depends on how many prereqs you have. If you have a couple remaining, then you can go to a local community college and complete them there. If you have all the pre-med prereqs, I would look into a formalized post-bac program. Like UCLA Extension has one. There are other Cal States that offer them as well locally, and some privates offer them. I would suggest a formalized post-bac if that's an opportunity for you, if you have multiple prereqs remaining. If finances are a challenge, that's where you would consider the do-it-yourself post-bac at a community college, but just make sure those financial challenges are identified in the application, like in the other impactful experiences. So they're able to understand that need and then make up for it by also having a strong MCAT score on the other end. Med schools view taking summer classes at UCLA compared to taking the same classes during the school year any differently? No, as long as you're able to perform at that same level. And then if you're not performing at the same level, they won't look at it and say like, oh, well, that was a summer course, it was faster. They still expect that same level of performance. So just make sure if you're doing classes in a short session, you're able to do well with them. Strong extracurriculars can make up for a lower MCAT score to a degree. If your MCAT score is like more than 3 points below the average of a certain school's MCAT score, then that's going to be a little bit hard to compensate for, even with experiences, unless you're like hundreds of hours above their experience expectation. And that's where I would say if you have very strong letters from individuals that are and are related to the experiences that you've had, and then also strong letters from those that may have affiliations to the medical school, that can also help. Connections are a big thing in the medical school application process. So that's one of those ways that it can compensate for a low MCAT score. But low MCAT score below like 508 for MD is going to be hard to compensate for in general. I have seen students get into MD with like 503, 504, and a few of them had like thousands of hours more than required. One was actually a UCLA applicant and they got in with a 506 MCAT. They had over like 3,000 hours of clinical, over 2,000 hours community or research and multiple publications. They'd taken a couple gap years off to be able to kind of crank out those hours. They were also an international student. Well, not an international student, immigrated here years ago, while they were early in the college process, but by the time they applied, were no longer international. Nuances with that. But just to share that it is possible, it can compensate, but you need multiple factors to really go right, and you need to have exceptional experiences that most other pre-meds are not pursuing. Psych and social classes do help you prepare for the MCAT, so those are helpful to have under your belt. If you're working in a clinic post-grad and applying to med school, let's say in May for this cycle, but don't start the clinic until August, is there a way to add these hours? Or say that you'll be starting this experience? You can input planned hours. However, keep in mind, you do still want a bulk of the experience hours identified in that area before you apply. So if you're starting a clinic in like or anytime after May, I would say you still want to be applying with like at least 350 clinical hours before that point to be able to showcase you've been in clinical settings. If you're not within 3 points of an MCAT score of a school, do they automatically rule you out? They do not automatically rule you out, but it becomes much harder to get in, and the rest of the application really needs to compensate. Now, if there's like a section that's below or multiple sections that's below a 125 and you're like 4 points below their average MCAT, that could be something that can rule you out pretty easily. But 3 points below doesn't automatically rule you out by any means. It just becomes a little bit harder to have other areas of the application compensate. Again, there are lots of opportunities to pursue exceptional clinical opportunities, creating impact with research, things like that, that can all make a really big difference in the long run. Yeah, you can absolutely self-study sociology and psychology. Since most schools don't have those as prereqs, that is an option. A lot of students just choose to do those too as part of their general education because they end up utilizing it for the MCAT later on. So it just helps to have it. But if it's not on the required course list, it doesn't hurt you in any way to not have it. Planned hours do count within the 15 experiences. All right, I'm going to answer a couple more questions right now, and then I'm going to dive into the rest of the lecture so we can make sure that we are able to finish everything. But I appreciate all of you being so involved in this session. Is working at a psychiatric IOP considered good enough clinical experience, even though it's mostly psych behavioral focused? So if you can save that question for the end and tell me a little bit more about what you do on the day-to-day, we can consider it. And also if you work with like the psychiatrist, nurses in that setting directly or not, it could work, but I would still say having some hours outside of like that behavioral tech setting. But again, like hold on to that question and ask me a little bit more about that at the end so we can build on it. Or you can always email me as well and we can discuss via, a little more detail there. We are going to discuss the MCAT points in a moment when we dive into school selection. So if you can hang tight for that, we'll go into that. Is it okay to take biochem, microbiome, immunology, genetics, pharmacology, histology before applying for California or out of state? Yeah, absolutely. You can take those, but you honestly don't need a lot of those classes for medical school. Like pharmacology, histology, pathology are not on the list of required courses for many schools. And biochem, it's on the MCAT, so that's helpful. Um, and microbiome depends on the school, but you definitely don't need to do all of those courses. Again, the Gen Chem, Gen Bio, OChem, physics, English are kind of the core, and then some supplemental classes outside of that would also be considered. Okay, letters of recommendation. So there are such things as committee letters and individual letters, but since UCLA doesn't have the committee letter or letter packet, we're just going to go straight into individual letters. So each of you as students will be looking into letters of recommendation. Oh, you can't see my screen. Okay, let me share it again. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so those of you that are applying this cycle, this is the time to start looking into letters. You want to give all your letter writers more than enough time to write. So if you're requesting in March, you're giving them a couple months to be able to write, which is great. It also gives you time to have backups in the event that one of your letter writers either doesn't respond or doesn't get the letter to you in time or doesn't feel they can write a strong enough letter. Believe me, this happens way more often than you anticipate, where a student has like 4 or 5 letters planned, and then May comes around and 2 of the letter writers haven't sent anything to them. So it's best to kind of over prepare up front, have too many letters. and then select which schools you select letters to later on, as opposed to kind of falling in a position where you fall short later. Schools will have different letter criteria. Some will accept 3, some will accept up to 6. 4 is the most common. But again, some will allow you to have those core 4 and then supplemental letters outside of it. The most common letters that I suggest students obtain will be 2 academic letters, one falling within their major. So if that's a science major, then it'll also be another science letter, and then another being a specific science letter. So if a student is, let's say, like a bio major, they may have 2 different science letters to be able to identify, one being the major, the other one being like a science letter. In some cases, like if you are a science major, I do suggest having like a supplemental letter within social sciences or humanities, just in case a school requires that, as we do see that occasionally. It's also suggested to have a research letter, a clinical letter, and if you're gathering additional letters, supplemental academic letters work, leadership letters work, like if you're a club president or student government president or in any sort of leadership capacity in student government and your sorority or fraternity, in a club or organization on campus. If you are like a supplemental instructor, a tutor, things like that, those can all come with letters as well. Any sort of community involvement or underserved clinics or after school programs that you've participated in, serving underserved populations. And if you are applying to DO schools, it is essential for you to have a DO letter to be able to showcase your understanding of the osteopathic philosophy. If you are applying to MD schools, it is highly recommended to have that clinical letter be from someone that is a physician, just so that they're also able to identify that your patient experiences kind of align with that of the responsibilities of a physician. Have you've shown the bedside manner that'll allow them to feel confident in your ability to work with patients in the future. If that's not the case, you may want to consider a supplemental shadowing MD letter as well to be able to have that. So yes, for your letters, this is the ideal time to start pursuing that. It's a great timeline to seek out the letters. If you are applying next year or in the future, and you know that you have a professor now that you have a great relationship with or have had one in the last year, take advantage of the opportunity now and request that letter. And you can always have it stored in a third-party service like Interfolio, where you can just have your letters sit there. And then once you're ready to apply, be able to pull that, because that makes it easier for you to be able to then have that letter in a timely manner when you need it. And you already are asking for that when you've built that relationship. Sometimes when you ask for it like a year later, it becomes a little bit difficult to be able to have that strong letter because they may not remember you or have the same relationship with you at that time. So you are able to upload letters of rec later on. Technically, you don't need your letters submitted until you're basically ready to have the committees review your application, which happens after you've submitted your primary app, your secondary app, your letters, obviously your transcripts, but that's way earlier, and your Casper or preview if it's needed by a school. So technically, if you do start something later, you can upload a letter later on as well, but I wouldn't suggest that for more than like one letter, just because it becomes a little bit risky to showcase multiple letters coming later on and makes them wonder what had occurred with your experience previously that held you back from getting letters before. If a letter writer agrees to write a letter, and you've like given them all the components, then try to get or give them a timeline up front of when you would want them to have the letter ready, and check in around a week before that to ensure that they're following along with a timeline that aligns with your preferences. Okay, school selection. So with the school selection process, it's very important to create a strategic list that allows you to incorporate MD and DO options. If you're applying to both DO and MD, you want a list that allows you to encompass a bit of both. I'd say if you're applying to both, around 20 MD, 10 DO is a good diverse batch. I like seeing students apply to a minimum of 20 schools in general. If you're applying to MD and DO, 30 is a good point, with again around 20 MD, 10 DO, depending on your stats and state residency and things like that. If you are applying solely DO, you can probably get away with applying to like 10 to 12 schools. On the higher end, I like capping students at 38, or suggest capping students at 38 schools, just because if you go beyond that, sometimes you may be applying to schools that you don't qualify for as easily, or maybe applying to schools with stats or preferences that don't align, or have like out of state preferences or in-state preferences. Or you may be applying to too many schools, which could then delay the next parts of your application cycle, being your secondaries, and could get in the way of the quality of the secondaries you submit later. So on that scope, I tell students like 38 on the high end is my suggestion. There are ways to work around that, but again, those are kind of strategies to optimize, but 20 is kind of my safe point. You want to have a range of target, reach, and safe schools. A large part of the target, reach, and safe school list will come with your MCAT score and GPA. Ideally, schools that are within 3 points of your MCAT score will be target schools, and schools within 0.3 of your GPA. So within 0.3 of your GPA and within 3 points of your MCAT. So for most students, GPA is in the target range in 90% of cases. So the MCAT is really what you look for like the target in that capacity, again, along with your state residency and any preferences they have for that. So you want to have the bulk of your schools in that target range. Safe schools will be schools with an MCAT score more than 3 points below yours. So let's say you have like a 515 MCAT score. If you're applying to schools with like a 511 or lower, those would be safer for you. And then reach schools will be schools that have an MCAT score 4 points or more higher than yours. So let's say you're applying to schools and you have a 510 MCAT score, schools with a 514 or higher will be reach in your case. That's not to say that you can't get in. You absolutely can. That's just to say that you want to be strategic with your school list and maybe apply to a few less of those, and ensure that the ones that you're applying to that are reach have other ranges that will make you more competitive. Like maybe your experiences align really well with what they offer. Maybe you're in state for them and they have really high in-state acceptances. Maybe your mentor went there and has a ton of connections and is really willing to have you network with individuals there. So you want to be strategic with which schools you have on the list for your reach schools. When you're also navigating your school list, always research schools and make sure that each school has values and goals that align with your pathway. You want to be able to have that mission alignment, ensure that they have qualities of as the school that align with what you want in the program, whether it's mentorship, whether it's the labs they have, whether it's the simulations, whether it's the curriculum and the coursework offered, when they start clinical experience, global opportunities, the class as a whole, class size. So all these factors kind of come into that school selection process. But again, a big part of the strategy is going to be utilizing stats and location as a starting point to open that door. But with 20, 30 schools, you're going to be able to identify so many different types of schools in that list, where you'll be able to really have an expansive range in general. With your school selection process, I usually suggest starting that around March or April. So many students usually take the MCAT in March. So with that, by April, you'll typically have your MCAT score. which will allow you to then be able to have a strong idea of which schools kind of fall in that target safe reach area for us to be able to identify a particular school list for you. So April is a really good timeline for you to have that school selection process, and then that'll also help you be able to see like which schools fall in the range of the prereqs you've taken and things like that, and if there are any final components you need to hit before applying. Now, one thing I didn't put a slide for that we do need to cover as well is the primary application. This is the transition from the school selection point and the point of your MCAT and GPA coming in, along with your prereqs, your experiences, letter writer names, and personal statement, which then leads you into the next phase of the application. So the primary application is going to open up in May for you to then submit ideally in May. All the steps that we've discussed until this point are for you to be able to utilize all the components, bring all those components together to submit the primary application, which will then go to all the MD schools within that application portal. For MD schools, MCAS will open usually the first week of May for you to start working on the application. And then you'll be able to submit the end of May. Usually it's the Tuesday after Memorial Day that application opens up for submission. Your goal is to submit within the first 2 weeks. For AA Comos, that application usually opens the first week of May, and you are usually able to submit the first day that it opens. So for that, DO schools do have a little more flexibility with the application timeline, but note that the day it opens, you can start submitting. Factor to keep in mind is that there is also the Texas application, which is TMDSAS. With the TMDSAS application, that one prioritizes Texas residents. The application timeline still falls within May, and there's opens for submission mid-May, so a little bit earlier than AMCAS. If you do have questions about the Texas application, let me know at the end. But again, they do prioritize Texas residents for application. One thing to note, or another thing to note for the primary application, is that it's really important to submit as early as possible, because this is going to be the factor that dictates the pace of everything else moving forward for you. With that primary application submission date, that's going to make a difference in when you get your secondaries, when your application is ready to be reviewed, and how early you can start getting interviews, and also how many students have already been reviewed before you have. So it really works well for you to submit your application earlier. Again, applications open in May. For AMCAS specifically, it's highly encouraged to submit that by the end of May, really within 2 weeks of the opening date, so even early June. It can extend out into the first month, but if you're doing that, be aware of how this can then end up impacting you, because if your application is verified a little bit later, considering the moment you submit your primary application, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for AMCAS to verify your application. So during that period, you're not getting any activity from AMCAS. Every day that your application is submitted later delays the process of you being able to get that application verified sooner, and leads to potentially thousands of students getting secondaries before you. So your goal is to submit your primary application as early as possible. Again, within the first 2 weeks of opening date is ideal, within the first month, but even first month is a little late, but first 2 weeks ideal, within the first 2 months, still workable. If you're going past June, it is getting a bit late and may end up impacting your application timeline and cycle. If you do see you're falling late with your primary application submission timeline, make sure you are on top of your secondaries and submitting those immediately to compensate for any lost time. All right, now we can dive into the next thing. So Casper and Preview. These are both going to be situational judgment tests that are required by some medical schools to be able to understand how you identify interpersonal skills effectively and how you handle yourself in different scenarios. This will oftentimes assess different behavioral factors, and in many other cases, will also have you identifying different factors that you'll see in day-to-day life scenarios and have you assess them. For Casper, this is going to be through video responses and written responses. So they will give you a scenario and you'll be able to provide your description in one of those two formats. For preview, they will give you scenarios and they will kind of have you rank through four like multiple choice options, which one best aligns, which answer best aligns with the prompt that was suggested. And with that, they're really trying to push for identifying like AAMC core competencies. It's ideal to take Casper and Preview anywhere between the spring to July to maximize your chances of an early application review. This is where your MCAT timeline will make a difference in when you take Casper, along with how you're doing with all those essays we spoke about. We obviously don't want this to get in the way of other commitments, but it is something that you want to take if it's required by even one of your schools. So really anywhere from like April to July is an ideal time to take it. Keep in mind, your goal is to have all your secondaries done by the end of July or middle of August. So if Casper and Preview take a few weeks to be scored, that means really July is kind of that end point that you want to push for, because that will mean you'll get that score by middle of August, which will then align with that later point of secondaries if you're pushing that timeline. So that would mean you'd be able to be reviewed for applications for interviews at that phase. These are all the little timeline nuances that come up in the summer that you want to keep in mind, but just be wary of Casper and Preview. And note that once your secondary start, you will be very busy writing. So try to take it before or after, because honestly, secondaries really become a full-time job for students. You kind of think that once you finish the MCAT and like the primary app, you've made it to the end, but the secondaries kind of start that clock all over again. So just be wary of that, because it is a lot of work when you dive into this phase, and it's a lot of writing to do in a fast period. The purpose of the secondaries is to navigate school-specific essays to be able to show schools your alignment with their mission, values, and class expectations. Every school will have different secondaries. There will be some common themes that you'll find with the secondary prompts. So that's where it's going to be best to start pre-writing your secondaries as early as possible, so that on one end, you'll be able to maximize your timeline. On the other end, you'll be able to maximize content and really do your best to build essays for different prompts, so that once you get your official secondaries, it'll be much easier to just plug and pull and tailor and navigate them more quickly. With the secondaries, this is where, you know how we spoke about that 4 to 6 week turnaround time with primary verification? You want to use that time period to start pre-writing secondaries. It's a very essential time to take advantage of, because nothing's going to be happening with your primary application at that point. So you want to use this to pull past prompts to start writing essays, so that once you get them from the medical schools, you will be ready to dive in very aggressively and start this writing process, or really start the submission process since you've already been writing for a while. I am not kidding. You may end up writing 200 pages worth of essays by the end of your secondaries, at least 100 for sure, but there's even a chance you'll get to 200 pages. It is a lot of writing, a lot of essays. So you want to jump on this early, because this is the timeline that can become a big challenge for students, since it's something that comes in a phase where you kind of think you've made it to the end, but also requires so much time and commitment. As you are navigating these secondaries, make sure that you are focusing on new insights and experiences. So even if you're talking about the same experiences that you included in your primary application, be sure that you are including a different perspective toward those experiences, so that you're giving them something new. You always want to be giving them new information. And with secondaries, your goal is to submit these within 2 weeks of receiving them. Some schools will give you a 2 to 3 month turnaround time. Please don't follow that because that will set your application much later, will delay your process, which can then end up impacting you on your likelihood of earning an acceptance. So aim for submission within 2 weeks. If 2 weeks becomes 3 weeks, even 4 weeks, sometimes it could be okay. But again, the most ideal timelines are what we're discussing here. Once those secondaries are submitted and you have worked through basically at this point your primary application, your secondaries, all your letters are in, you have your Casper or preview scores in, or maybe even both, you can be reviewed for an interview. Schools can start providing interviews anywhere from July or August. For DO schools, it usually starts in July. For MD schools, it usually starts in August and runs through February or March. Now, sometimes there are nuances of schools being able to provide interviews even beyond that period, but kind of keep that in mind as the overarching timeline. August to February for MD, July to March for DO. The interview purpose is to really be able to assess if you are a fit for the medical school and to really identify your communication skills. So they've read everything about you at this point. Now it's kind of like a little bit of a fit check to make sure you align with the school. And it's your opportunity to also ensure that the school aligns with what you want as well. So keep in mind that when you're doing a medical school interview, you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. With the interview, make sure you know your why. Ensure you are aware of why you are looking to pursue a career in medicine, why you will be able to contribute to the school, and all the experiences that you've pursued that align with what the school is looking for. Also have an understanding of the different interview types and formats because you want to be able to prepare for the right kind of interview. The most common interview that you'll see is going to be the traditional interview. So that's usually like the one-on-one interview with core questions like tell me about yourself, why medicine, tell me about your clinical experience, all that stuff. But you will also have things come up like MMIs, which are multiple mini interviews, which will be scenario-based interviews where they'll give you a situation and you'll have 4 to 6 minutes to answer that situation and how you would navigate it. Being able to, again, see those communication skills, critical thinking skills, decision making on the spot, critical thinking. And then there are also group interviews where you will be in an interview with multiple other candidates, and they'll either be asking you the same question or different questions. Sometimes they'll even have you do an activity together. And then there's also the panel interview where you will be an applicant with multiple interviewers who will be asking you different questions. You also have the hybrid interview. With the hybrid, that's going to be a combination of different interview types. As you're learning about these interviews, make sure you take the time to do mock interviews. Sorry about that. Mock interviews that are going to be essential in allowing you to understand your strengths in interviews, your weaknesses, and navigating different question types to ensure you have an understanding of how to respond to multiple different types of questions. The best way to prepare is with practice, and the best way to practice is with a mock interview so you are able to continuously get feedback. All right, so then comes the letter of interest. Letters of interest are usually sent out a little bit later in the application to show schools your continued interest in the school, along with any updates that have occurred since applying. So it's letter of interest or update letters. This is, again, to kind of let the school know that you're still interested. You may not have gotten an interview yet, and you want to give them updates. This can be things like a clinical experience you've had, a new research publication, a new experience you've had that's nowhere else on your application. Sometimes you may even be waiting for grades for extra classes that you've taken, and those may also come by in the fall as well. So in that case, if you submit that letter in December or January, they'll be able to get those updates too. Again, with this, you want to show your continued interest, your fit with the school, identify experiences that you've pursued that align with what the school is looking for, and ensure you're always giving them something new. So you want to continuously, anytime you send a letter of interest or update letter, ensure that you are giving them new experiences to have this contribute something to your application. Be aware that not all schools accept these letters. So that's where we want to make sure we're checking in on them, or else there's kind of no purpose to it. You don't want to submit things just to submit it and waste your time. If they tell you they're not going to use it, they're not going to use it. So make sure anytime you're submitting information to schools, it's with intention. So check the different school sites to be able to indicate which ones accept letters, and be sure you're submitting the letter of interest with intention. Then we have the letter of intent. The letter of intent is a letter that you will send out after an interview with a school to be able to show your continued interest and let them know of your intent to attend this school if you are accepted. So your goal is to basically let them know that, hey, if I get in here, I'm going to go here, so that they know that you are a competitive applicant and one that is serious about their program and won't turn them down if they accept you. So the goal is to increase your chance of getting in by pursuing the pathway of submitting a letter of intent. But make sure if you are doing this, you are very serious about looking into this school, because it's very frowned upon to submit one and then take it back. It's ideal to submit this within 2 weeks if you absolutely know a school is your top choice school. But if you are looking into multiple schools and you're not really sure where you want to go and you've had multiple interviews, wait it out a little bit until, let's say, like December, so that you have a better idea of where you stand with an interview accumulation before you send this out, because you don't want to send it to one school when you have like multiple interviews out and you have others that are higher up on the list. With the letter of intent, again, you're sharing experiences that align, that you've had that align with their mission, showing your continued interest in why you want to go there, and focus on your intent to attend if they accept you. And at this point, the goal is to have gotten acceptances. So now you have gotten to the point of receiving acceptances, made it through the entire cycle, and it's now planning for your success with this next phase in understanding what different schools offer and how you will be able to be the best candidate at these different schools and have the best medical education. When you have those acceptances, it's going to be your chance to be a little bit picky unless you navigated the letter of intent. So this is where you want to consider looking into the program curriculum, offerings of the program, tuition rates, residency match, any specialized programs that they offer, mentorship, labs that you're interested in terms of research opportunities and publication opportunities, to all be able to indicate which school you should accept and the route that you should take. But ultimately, you have made it to a point of success at this time, and hopefully we'll be able to use the information from this application timeline workshop to be able to ensure a successful application cycle that leads you to positive results, and also shows you the importance of patience, because applying to medical school does require a lot of patience. It is not an easy process at all. And really being able to sit in the unknown sometimes is a really significant part of it. I even contacted a school this week regarding a student that was waitlisted at a certain school, and they said they have a very strong chance of being pulled from the waitlist, but just utilize this time to really see patience as a value and that really showcases a huge perspective for the entire application process. Patience is really going to be tested the next year or so for many of you, but know that the outcome is going to be worth it. And it's going to get you to a very, very strong point at the end of the day of being able to become future physicians. And you absolutely want to be able to take advantage of that. So I thank you all for being here today, and I will utilize the next few minutes to be able to answer any questions. Also, please keep in mind that I am available to be able to connect with you if you have any other questions or want to be able to discuss anything that we addressed today, but you didn't ask about or would prefer to ask about in private based on your own individual case. You can reach out to me at nicole@nextstepadmit.com. You can also check out my website, nextstepadmit.com, or find me on social media, Instagram or TikTok at Next Step Admissions Prep. I appreciate you all being here today. And again, I will take out a few moments now to be able to address any last questions.